Welcome everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. This is another online Interact event. We can consider it as the last one of the series of post-2020 events that we offer this package for all the programs to help you, assist you during your programming phase. Today's event will be dedicated to ISO 2, a safer and more secure Europe. My name is Bessiana, and together with my colleagues, Interact colleagues, Kelly and Ivana, we will run this session today. And of course, we are happy to have also our colleague, Gilles Kittel from D1 unit, Macro Region, Transnational and Interregional Cooperation, and IPA and Enlargement Negotiation Unit in DG Regio. I hope you will get some answers related to this Interreg Specific Objective. Is a new specific objective, is a peculiar specific objective, and today we hope during this 1.5 hour session, we hope to provide you as much as possible with information and clarities in order for you to use and embed this specific objective in your program. And this is all from my side. Gilles, the floor is yours.
So good afternoon to everyone. I'm very glad to be with you. I would like to thank first Bessiana, Interact, for organizing this session. So today we want to update you on the latest changes. In this context, I would like to say a few words about myself. So I'm in charge of the team dealing with IPA, user, and the accession negotiations in DG Regio. Obviously, we are working very much together with DG NIR. On this specific objective, we are more focused on external borders. So clearly, Simon Apolova's team is also very much concerned, and also Pierre Emmanuel, so the outmost regions. So I'm in a way representing today those two other teams. We really start the presentation itself, and we go through the questions. I would like to thank you also, Oana and Mauro, for their presentation. So they gave you some practical hint into this specific objective. So I would like really to thank them. So I hope you had the opportunity to watch the different presentations put on the website, on Interact website, because obviously the specific objective needs to be understood in its context. And the context is obviously very geostrategic compared to some other. I'm happy to discuss the slides. So if you want, we can come back to the slides if there is any need for that. Otherwise, I will actually show you a presentation that I've made with the questions. Thank you.
Okay, so first to tell you that obviously, maybe you are well aware, especially with this specific objective, many things have changed following the crisis. Obviously, the regulation was written before the pandemic in Europe, and there are now changes in the pipe. And they might affect, obviously, this specific objective. The presentation is made on common understanding, intention that we have. The mechanics are not yet fully stable. Therefore, you need to take our suggestions and answers with some care. They are the reflect of the best knowledge we have at this time, but they might still evolve in light of the negotiations with the Council and the Parliament. Okay, so let us move then to the questions. So I will. So it's really based on your questions. So I've divided the presentation in 5 parts. The last one will be actually the second part that Bessiana already mentioned to you. So there are 4, I would say, main headings for those questions. The first one is about the kind of action that can be supported by ISO 2. The second heading is about the eligibility of actions and the potential beneficiaries under ISO 2. The third one is about the indicators that can be used for ISO 2. And the last one is related to COVID-19, the COVID-19 pandemic. So let us move to the first one. Which kind of action to be supported? So to give you some light about this. So I'm reading with you first the questions that we have received, and then we will try to answer to this. The first one is about the scope and the extent of ISO 2. The second one is about the proposed new measures. The third one is I assume you will recognize yourself, the ones who raised this question about to get more information on the type of action and how to implement ISO 2. The fourth one is how could you choose this ISO 2 without interfering with political issues. The fifth one is more related to the outmost programs, and the sixth one is about possible examples. So we summarize them under three keywords: political dimension, approach, and possible areas of interventions. Political dimension, if I refer to the presentation which is on the website, it is obviously a very political objective, no doubt. And it is also very clear, and that's why we asked DG Home to make some presentations about their funds, that any action should be coordinated primarily with them, because they are the main funders on this, and clearly we can only complement what they would program. So there's no doubt in our mind. We are working with DG Home on this objective, so we are still working on, let's say, additional guidance, but it is very obvious that our DG Home is the leading DG on the issue. About the outmost programs, I need to say also that the suggestions that we're making are primarily targeting the external borders. So in that respect, outmost programs are covered. With the internal borders, obviously, they are normally within the Schengen area. So there are things that you cannot do in most of the cases, not always. All member states are not part of the Schengen area, but in many cases, there are things that you cannot do on the internal border that you can do on the external ones, and that's why, if you are looking at my presentation, the suggestion, for instance, with the border crossing points, this is essentially for the external borders, not for the internal ones. About the possible interventions, again, that was presented during my presentation. So I divided my presentation as it is structured by DG Home with the three main funds. And for those three funds, I gave you some hint, but it is very clear for us that the main area of intervention should be border management. That's very clear. Linked to that, there is the COVID-19 and the green lanes that probably you have heard about, which actually are ways for us to facilitate the circulation of goods between member states during the pandemic, since the borders were closed for health reasons. That was a way to ensure a continuous flow of the goods between member states and to avoid disruption of the production chains. That's obviously very important, and we think that this objective, ISO 2, could help even in the internal borders for that, clearly. I will then move to the next one, so the question 7 to question 11. So the question 7 is how to delimitate the action supported under ISO 2 from those financed from the other EU instruments, funds. Also, there are many questions, actually, 3 questions, question 8, 9, and the following, on ISO 2 and ISO 1. the link that we can make on ISO 2 between ISO 2 and ISO 1. And then there is an interesting question, the question number 11, about the low budget. So in case of low budget, whether there is it still envisaged to finance any type of action under ISO 2. So if I start with question number 7. So in the presentation I made, I tried to illustrate how first you should distinguish ISO 2 from the mainstream programs, because there are things which are financeable under ERDF, but through the mainstream programs, and then we don't think it is a good idea to finance them through ISO 2. The second step that we illustrated in the presentation is how to distinguish ISO 2 from the other Interreg policy objectives, especially PO2 and PO4. Again, if you are not careful, there might be some overlaps, and that's something that we think you should avoid. And obviously, better to finance those actions than through either PO2 or PO4. But ISO 1, we don't think that there should be any overlap, since ISO 1 is essentially about the governance, while ISO 2 is about security and safety. So there's no real reasons to mix those two instruments. The other thing I need to say is that on that aspect in particular, the regulation is still not stable at all. There are very divergent opinions between the Commission, the Parliament, and the Council. So we need to be careful, and it's very difficult to draw conclusions and to make guidance on this particular point at this stage. Again, I invite you to consult my presentation on the link, possible link that we can make between ISO 1 and ISO 2 at the present time. But it is very clear that the three institutions, Parliament, Commission, and Council, have still a very divergent view on the issue. About the low budget operation, we think, and we are convinced, that you can make some difference. And we had the conversation with DG Home on that, because obviously compared to them, our budgets are very, very smaller. But they are nonetheless convinced that we can complement each other. So obviously that should be carefully analyzed with your desk officer. But we think, and we have still ongoing discussion with DG Home, that you can very well complement the main funds of like the ones used by DG Home, and there are certainly operations that you can finance under ISO 2. Then I kept this question for the end of this heading, let's say, or this first section, which is about to say that this objective can be obviously perceived in two ways. It can be seen as a way to improve the condition at the border, as you can see, but it could be also perceived as a sign of hostility towards migrants, and in a way could be perceived as a way to build up a wall around Europe. So in that context, I would like to reassure you, at least the way we see it in DG Regio, is that on the contrary, we are convinced that we have to build EU on the principle of solidarity, and there is absolutely no question for us to build up a wall, but just to improve let's say the flows at the borders to ensure security against plenty of types of threats. They can be natural threats, but also human threats. They can be linked to animal diseases, or you can think about plenty of reasons which can support this objective without building up walls against migrants, because this is certainly not what we want, and that's not what we are suggesting. So if I have to summarize this first section, the first one, let's say, element that we would like to underline, and that was actually presented by our president, van der Leyen, is that peace, security, and development are mutually dependent. So therefore, we are convinced that ISO 2 is essential and will enhance the achievement of the other objectives that you might want to achieve under a given program. So in that context, we think that it's really a matter of complementarity, and it's very important that you ensure peace and security in the EU, and the borders in that respect are an important element. The second element, which is also highlighted in my presentation, is that it is very clear that this specific objective requires a very integrated and coordinated approach, meaning that, and that was shown in more details in my slides, there are different ways to coordinate with the other instruments, the other EU funds, but it is very certain that you need to set up sophisticated coordination mechanism with also central bodies, because if I take the example of the funds managed by DG Home, they are obviously targeting institutions like the Ministries of Interior, and therefore that means that you need to establish contacts with them if you want to have a good coordination. We are not against what we call positive overlaps. That was actually mentioned also by DG Home in their document, in their papers. So for them, it's not a problem if we have some overlaps, but we consider that considering the scarce resources that we have under ETC and even the low percentage which might be dedicated to ISO 2, those positive overlaps should remain limited. And as I said, you should also identify how you can complement and create synergies with the other ETC policy objectives, in particular PO2 and PO4, and then the mainstream programs, because for some issues, like for instance, the migrants, the mainstream programs, or the urban security, the mainstream programs are normally the main contributors for this kind of objective. You have also to keep always in mind, but that's, I think it's true for all our objectives and all our operations, the European added value. So obviously we should make the difference with this. That is very important to consider this, this objective. And the last one is what I've just explained to you, is that EU is built on solidarity, and that remains very important when we are defining the objectives in general, and in particular this ISO 2. So when we are talking about partner countries, that should remain a real partnership, and we, and that was expressed, we want to be very close to them, and it's really for us a matter of solidarity to strengthen all the areas that we are talking about. So border management, the migrants, the question of the migrants, also the protection of the critical infrastructures, but always with the idea that we help both sides. So now about the second, let's say, series of questions. It's about the eligibility of the actions and the potential beneficiaries under ISO 2. So you can see here we are an example with some planes, French and Italian. I will say a few words about this example. So the four questions that we receive about this are, the first one is about the type of potential applicants under ISO 2. The second question is more specific and relates to civil security and whether this can be financed under this ISO. The third one is whether infrastructure project can be financed under ISO 2. And the fourth one is actually close to the third one, is also to know whether the investment activities can be financed through ISO 2. So about the first one, actually, we considered that there is no special rule for ISO 2. So we invite you to consult the provisional CPR rules, which define who can be a beneficiary. It's in the Article 2. About the second question, the civil security, we think that this should normally be financed by other mechanisms. There are specific mechanisms, actually, for instance, managed by DG ECHO. Also, the PO2 can and should finance such an activity. So ISO 2 can only complement the actions already financed by the other funds and the other policy objectives. That would be our answer. About the question 3, yes, for sure, infrastructure project can be financed, and that's actually illustrated in my presentation, especially when we are talking about border management. So that's for us very clear that you can. Obviously, the budget is limited, therefore, probably we are talking about strategic projects. If you envisage to finance anything, it should be a kind of strategic project on the border, for instance. That would be typically the example that I would have in mind. So, as I said, the definition of the beneficiaries, I invite you to refer to the Article 2, paragraph 8 of the new CPR. Civil security, primarily through PO2 and the other instruments, so emergency support instrument, the EU civil mechanism, the rescue package, and infrastructure is for ISO 2. So I hope there is no doubt about this, but yes, for us it's very clear. About the indicators now. There are 3 questions about the indicators. The first one is to know whether you can use the common set of indicators. And it is mentioned that the scope for ISO 2 could be broader, for instance, the health risk. The second question is whether ISO 2 has some specific objectives and which indicator could be used. And the third one is more focused on border management and migration management, and to know whether there are specific indicators related to that issue. So our answer would be that to tell you first that the work is still very much in progress, but to refer actually to the output indicators and the result indicators that are defined for Interreg in general, so the common indicators. Obviously, you will have to see if they are relevant, and we can help you, certainly. But yeah, we don't see any reasons you should not use them in general. That would be our preliminary answers. COVID-19 pandemic. So that's obviously a very specific, we hope, issue and punctual one. So the first question that we receive is about border crossing. So what, in a way, how ISO 2 could help. And the second one is to know whether ISO 2 is expandable to cover safe medication practices during the time of pandemics. So our answer would be that for the question 1, and I think you, again, you can refer to my presentation. Yes, we think you can certainly use ISO 2, especially for the green lanes. As we say, that's the first example that I give you under the heading border management, and that is very important. And I need to say that green lanes exist not only on the internal borders, but they exist also on the external borders. The points have been identified. You have a map actually that I put on in my presentation. And it's very important that we can maintain those green lanes. We don't know whether we will face now a second wave, but in any case, it's very important that we maintain a continuous flow of goods among us in order to avoid any disruption of the chain, of the production chain in our countries. Safe medication practices, yes, as well, but probably more through transnational programs and macro-regional strategies. And here, because so far we have not talked very much about macro-regional strategies, obviously we have to consider the action plan of those macro-regional strategies. Two of them have already modified the action plan, so then the room for maneuver is probably limited. But there are two others for which the action plan needs to be revised in the coming months, and there probably we can foresee some safe, to cover the safe medication practices. And in any case, it could be a good idea in some area, for instance, in the user area, to develop safe medication practices among partner countries. That could be indeed an idea. Obviously, that's something that the managing authority should discuss with the partner countries, but we think that that could be indeed a good idea. So again, and that's actually very much related to my replies to the first set of questions. You need for that, for the COVID-19 pandemic, to strengthen an integrated and coordinated approach with the other funds, because there are obviously many other funds covering this COVID-19 pandemic and other instruments. You need also to complement and create synergies with the other ETC policy objectives and the mainstream programs. That's also very important. So again, the idea with this ISO 2 is rather to really target to fill in the gaps that maybe others have not yet covered. That would be my advice. European added value, again, in that respect, that remains for us a very essential principle. And obviously, especially with the COVID-19 pandemic, the solidarity is very important, and this is an area where we have certainly to improve all together, and therefore we think that ISO 2 could help with obviously others. That's not the only one which can help Europe to be more careful of each other. So I'm now almost at the end of at least the suggestions for the set of questions that we receive. Obviously, I'm now happy to answer other questions, to answer also questions that you might have on my presentation or the presentation of my colleagues, because I need to say also that with regard to GHOME, you might have questions that I will gladly gather and that I will later discuss with them, and we will provide you with some written answer in the coming days if you need, obviously. So now so to repeat for the conclusion that first, solidarity is essential. That's really something on which we hope that there is no misunderstanding. And then to insist on this mutual dependency between peace, security, and development. And that's really the raison d'être of ISO 2. So I would like to thank you at least for this first set. I will now pass the floor to Bessiana and the team. I'm obviously available to answer any question. Thank you.
Our colleagues are asking for the type of interventions in regard to ISO 2. Will there be a list of types of intervention as for other policy objectives?
Okay. For that, I would suggest maybe if you can put my presentation on the screen, my main presentation, then I can show you. So those are the specific objectives first that we have defined for this specific objective number 2. So border management infrastructure, that's the first one. Second one is mobility and migration management. The third one is protection and integration of migrants. And then the fourth one is other actions to contribute to a safer and more secure Europe. So you see in the fourth one, obviously, there is purposely a certain room for maneuver. So if I move on in my presentation, I will then show you there are more examples about the, so I'm just moving on. So, yeah, so the first one is those green lanes that I mentioned. And you can see on the map that those are the main roads that should remain open in any circumstances, even during the COVID-19 pandemic. And then you have, you can see them in the legend on the left side, the top left of the slide. You see border crossing point corridors, border crossing point core, border crossing point comprehensive. Those are actually points where we can have, especially on the borders, we can have some assistance, let's say. So that would be already an example that I would give you, even for the internal borders, so not only the external borders, because you can see also that there are points with the partner countries, but there are points also between member states or on internal borders. That is a first type of intervention that I would, and here maybe to explain you more, what type of things you can do for the green lane is you organize the checks on only one side of the border. Actually, the purpose is to avoid the loss of time for the truck drivers, but that can also apply on the trains. That can actually be extended, let's say, to many ways of transport. But the idea is really to reduce the time wasted by the drivers when they are at the border, and to rationalize the checks. And in that context, obviously, there are other DGs in charge of this, like Tax Sud or DG Home, but we can also, through ISO 2, we can also do certain things. And DG Move, obviously, is also an important DG. But again, you can certainly complement what those are doing. The next example that we are giving you is still under this heading of, I would say, border management, is about the integrated border management. So it's, I don't know how much you might be familiar with this, but this is actually a concept promoted by the EU to secure, especially, and strengthen the security on the EU external borders through the improvement of the border checks, through surveillance, and also, and that's important because that's not always well known, to protect supply chains. So again, here, this is in a way related to the first example, but the idea is really to facilitate the transfer of goods and at the same time to ensure that all the security aspects are properly handled. So we are talking about custom offices, but also plant product inspection offices, live animal inspection offices, food and feed animal inspection offices, and so on. So there are plenty of examples where you might want to finance operations, and we think that considering the budget that represent all those investments, we think that we can indeed help. Although, as we say, the big infrastructure projects are certainly not for ETC, considering the limited budget we have. But we can help and complement the other funds, the other instrument on this issue. The next one is actually about infrastructure. Those are the famous infrastructures that I mentioned. It's the upscaling and the replication of border crossing points infrastructure. The slide that you see here is a project which was financed by the NEI program, one NEI program between Finland and Russia. So we are convinced that there is a potential for more such projects. Obviously, this represents a significant amount, so that means that probably those projects need to be considered strategic to be given the sufficient priority. And they require obviously a certain amount of money. So most likely you will not be able to finance many of them, but one or two could be interesting and could be considered as flagship projects under your program. Then we have the integration of people with a migrant background. Here, actually, to be frank with you, we consider that ISO 2 should have a limited role. We are thinking about small-scale reception centers in cross-border areas, for instance, but normally the integration of people with a migrant background is essentially handled by the mainstream programs, not by ETC. And therefore, you should see if indeed there is a need which is not yet covered by the mainstream program, because again, we have limited resources, so it is certainly not to duplicate what the mainstream program can finance. Manage disaster risk better. This normally is covered through PO2. The only area where we saw some potential is on health threats, complementing other EU rapid alert systems, but through, I would call them soft measures, so sharing of experience, guideline, procedures, and certainly not, let's say, infrastructure project, because that is certainly not the purpose of ISO 2. So here, as we say, it's certainly in a very limited manner that you can use ISO 2, and that should be in complement with PO2 and maybe mainstream programs. Now, about the protection of all public sites against terrorist attacks and making cities more resilient, we consider this is essentially for the mainstream program, so that's not for ETC. Maybe you could think about examples on border areas, but that should be very limited. That's at least our impression. So we don't think that there's a big potential for you on that issue. On the protection of critical infrastructures, and especially the digital infrastructures, again, that should be normally financed through the mainstream programs. The only exception that we see is about infrastructure, which would be located in cross-border areas, but that should be, again, very marginal compared to the critical infrastructures in a country. So that's not very, very significant. So you can see from my presentation, and maybe I will just go to the conclusions, to say that, that actually we see a real potential for border management, some also possibilities for the hosting of migrants, and for the other areas, we are less convinced. About transnational, I need to say, and the macro-regional strategies, that there is certainly a potential for soft projects to improve, for instance, good practices in the geographical area. But that's something on which we are still working. And here, again, we should complement existing initiatives. So, for instance, I'm thinking about there are already in the Mediterranean area some transnational network of cities. Again, radicalism. Then the program ISO 2 could complement or extend this kind of initiative. We could consider that the transnational program can provide an holistic framework for some issues. But that needs to be further worked on by the Commission, because we are still very much thinking on that. On the urban security and with regard to transnational programs, yeah, we think that there might be some potential, but certainly not for cross-border. So that's also something I think important to highlight. We make a difference between cross-border and transnational program, and we think that for cross-border programs, it's essentially border management and very much less the hosting of the migrants or the protection of the migrants, while for transnational it could be wider. But the only thing I would say is that for transnational, we are thinking nonetheless that should remain soft measures. We don't see infrastructure project financed by transnational programs. We are, of course, very keen to listen to you. So if you have examples which would contradict our thinking, we welcome them very much, and we are absolutely ready to reflect with you on any possibility. So thank you.
Again, we are talking about the indicators. So what the level should indicators be defined for ISO 2, and what is considered a specific objective for ISO 2?
So for the specific objective, I think I showed you already what we define as specific objectives. With regard to indicators, no, we don't think. We think that you will have to use common indicators. There's at this stage at least no willingness to develop specific ones.
And if I may comment on this, it was also said during all the other events from other colleagues from D2 unit as well, that common Regio indicators should be used in order to show the added value of Interreg in the cohesion policy. So I think also in this case, it would be the case to use these indicators, and just only in very specific cases, program has to develop their own and provide all the relevant justification of this on this choice. So the next question is, could you please provide more details on the distinction of mainstream and Interreg programs, areas of intervention?
So I tried, but I can try to be more specific. It depends very much on the area of intervention. But when we talked about the protection of migrants, let's say the main distinction is that Interreg should intervene only in logically in cross-border areas when there is a necessity to cooperate with the partner country. We know also that now Interreg can be embedded in the mainstream programs, but that would be it. For some others, we would prefer, but that's something to discuss with each program, that some issues, let's say some topics, are essentially covered by the mainstream programs, like the protection of critical infrastructures or the resilience of the cities. This is actually to avoid a complex, let's say, separation between those two, knowing that, because you mentioned mainstream and Interreg program, but we need also to consider that there are other instruments and EU funds, so that might make the picture even more complex. So that's why we think it's important that we, in a way, simplify it. That's why also, if you refer to my presentation, so the presentation put on the website, I tried also to map the other funds. It's not exhaustive what I did, but at least you have a certain idea. Who else you see among EU funds is active on the topic? That's something to consider certainly as well. So to say on risk management, it should be normally PO2. We think that's better than to finance it through ISO 2, although it's not completely forbidden. But that should be PO2. migrants, that should be also PO4 mainstream. Urban security as well, mainstream, protection of critical infrastructure. So you see that then, following that reasoning, the main areas where you might have operations, project to finance are under border management and to much less extent the protection of the migrants. So that would be the way I would make, you see, the distinction, or to simplify. There might be exceptions, but that's, I think, the most simple way to present this demarcation between mainstream and Interreg on ISO 2.
Thank you, Gilles. And now we move on. The other question is again on the indicators, but I think we already answered to these questions. Or if you would like to add anything else on the indicators and output and result indicators for other POs.
To be frank with you, this is an area where I would prefer to put the answer on hold because we're still working on that. I understand there is a concern and we have to provide you with an answer, but we need to see first where we end with the legislation. And also on the indicators is still some work in progress. I mean, even on the other policy objectives. So we are absolutely ready to consider the remark and to encourage the use of ISO indicators across other POs. But this is something to be seen, let's say.
And the next question is, if well motivated, will the European Commission be satisfied even if programs develop ISO 2 actions within other policy objectives, or are there any strong recommendations by the Commission in this regard?
No, so as we say, we perfectly, for instance, imagine that risk management aspects are dealt with under PO2 and not ISO 2. So that would be fine, you see. There are other actions that we don't see in any other policy objective, like border management. So there then we would have a strong recommendation to finance it through ISO 2. But you can see this is probably the exception. Otherwise, indeed, you can finance most of the activities through the other POs. So.
Thank you. So the other question is about Horizon Europe, Customs, Digital Europe. How do you suggest we manage that?
Actually, Bessiana,
yes.
This is my
yes, please, Shabnam.
Hi, Gilles. Hi, Bessiana. Actually, this is a question, but it has a beginning. It should be further down. So there were character limitation. That's why I had to divide it. So the question begins further down. If you look at the questions, it begins with Gilles. In your present, yeah, this is the beginning, and the other is continuation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So the full question is, in your recorded presentation, you mentioned synergy and complementarity with other EU programs such as Erasmus and Horizon Europe, Custom, Digital Europe, etc. So how do you suggest we manage all this to identify these complementarities, I think is the question.
But that means that you need to be very careful when you draft your program. So you have to indeed identify the work. I have to say now, if I'm thinking about the strategies, I'm taking the example of the user. You could then also liaise with the people working on the strategy, because they have normally a view on some of those aspects, and they have more cross, let's say cross. We call it cross-pillar, cross-area view. In the IPA countries, normally you have the NIPAC and the NIPAC office, so they are supposed to coordinate all the actions, actually finance a bit in those areas. So yes, we are well aware that this will require a real effort of coordination that maybe you are not used to. That is, and that is certainly a challenge that ISO 2 might bring. On the other hand, this might also make actually this specific objective much more, in a way, effective and much more useful, because that would be a way to better coordinate also interact with other other EU policies. So in that respect, we are well aware that this is a challenge, but that might be also an opportunity.
Thank you. And the next question is about the differences between cross-border and transnational. So could you please explain which are the main differences in this regard?
Yeah, so at least our thinking is that with cross-border, you should limit, let's say, essentially to border management and less extend on protection of migrants. The other topics are not really relevant. I mean, very marginally they could be, but, and when I say border management, obviously I include the green lanes. So that's actually something related to the COVID-19 pandemic. While when we are thinking about the transnational programs, this is really different. We could also see the transnational programs as a way to coordinate, in a way, the mainstream programs of different member states on those issues. So there, obviously, we think that the potential for transnational programs is much higher. On the other hand, we are well aware that the transnational programs have, in general, quite limited budgets. So that's why we are thinking about soft measures, so exchanges of good practices, trainings among in the area among partner countries, things like that. But we think that for the transnational programs, the different areas that I've shown to you, so maybe less border management, but protection of migrants, also the risk management, the protection of critical infrastructure, also the urban agenda are actually topics which could be shared among the partner countries, and you can really complement existing initiatives, because we see a lot of initiatives on those areas and which are connected to this more secure, safer, and more secure Europe, but they need to be complemented. There is clearly a lack of continuity, let's say, of our actions, and that's why also I mentioned in my slide on the presentation on the website that it's important also that we capitalize on existing projects, because there are actually a lot of projects essentially financed by DG Home, but now they need to be continued in a way or kept, let's say, extended. And there we think that there is a potential for us to help to proceed to this capitalization.
Thank you. And once again, we have another question on the Interreg indicators, whether should be used, so the common Interreg indicators, or the European Commission will provide a common list. I think we already answered to this question, so yeah. I will just continue with the next one. So consider that programs has a small budget. Would that not be more effective to focus on ISO 1 also for actions related to security at borders?
Yeah, let's say it's to me it's more up to you to decide. It's difficult for the Commission to tell you. We are nonetheless considering that you can have still an impact, let's say, even with a limited budget. And there we are obviously not thinking about infrastructure projects, but there are now a lot of digitalization, for instance, of the checks, of the surveillance on the border and upscaling of the existing system, and that does not represent enormous amounts. So that might be also a way to use the money under ISO 2. So it's to say, yeah, I mean, we understand the concern. We need to see also, obviously, how much will be dedicated to ISO 1 and ISO 2, because this is still not decided. But we agree with you that obviously the budget is a parameter to consider in order to decide to finance actions under ISO 2. And ISO 1 is obviously very important. Also, that's also very clear.
Okay. The other question is, mainstream funds cover many aspects of the Interreg Specific Objective 2 for the member states, but these funds are not available for partner countries. So can, for example, disaster management be addressed, I suppose, from partner countries?
Yes, absolutely, they can. I mean, we can also think that I'm thinking about partner countries that they can be financed through IPA or NDK. They can be financed also through DG Home, because DG Home also can finance actions, especially in the post-2020 period, in third countries. They will have actually a relatively significant percentage of their budget dedicated to external countries or partner countries. But yes, again, I agree with you truly that ISO 2 can still complement, let's say, the major investments made under the mainstream funds. And that's also a way to bridge, let's say, with partner countries like IPA countries and NDK countries, to bridge mainstream funds and NDK or IPA funds. So there's sometimes a link missing that we can cover through ISO 2. So yes, you're absolutely right.
Thank you. I sent it in two parts. I think this is Shabnam, you, or there is another question. Yes. Okay.
That was my explanation.
Okay, perfect. So we can mark it as answered. And so the last three questions, the next one is not a question, it seems more a reflection. I partially agree that civil protection should be financed by other EU programs. However, the security is a cross-cutting issue and demands global approach.
No, but yeah, we agree with that. That's why we think that, especially through transnational programs, yes, you're right, this could be addressed. Not through cross-border programs, because then it's less likely that you have two, let's say, important cities covered by a program. But through transnational program, yes, certainly, the security issue can be covered through ISO 2 for this cross-cities issue, yes.
Thank you. So the last two questions. Any suggestions with regard to ensure complementarity under ISO 2 for IPA programs, and to what extent other DGs should be consulted with?
But they have absolutely to be considered. It's very, maybe you don't, you cannot figure out, but actually we have worked a lot with the other DGs, and indeed we will work with the delegations in case ISO 2 is chosen by some programs, especially with partner countries. Yeah, obviously the delegations and other DGs will be involved in when we review your programs, of your proposed programs, for especially the proposal for ISO 2 under those programs. Yes, certainly.
And the final question is, can ISO 2 support the protection of public spaces? You mentioned a bit in your presentation, but maybe you can develop a bit.
So yes, there is a slide you see in the presentation uploaded on Interreg website. So we think that normally that should be done by the mainstream program, not by ISO 2. Again, we see potential for transnational programs, but again, if we talk about the exchange of good practices or training on the way you can protect public spaces. Again, there are networks also of cities where we might, in a way, complement their activities with some new actions. There, yes, maybe. But for ISO 2 under cross-border programs, we think it should be marginal. we might be wrong. I mean, I'm very happy to hear to your examples, the contrary examples, if you think about areas where this could be useful. But our impression is that for the cross-border program, this should be normally ISO2 should be not very useful for the protection of public spaces, while it can be for the transnational programs.
Thank you, Gilles. If there are no more questions, then we reached the end of this Q&A session. So I would like to thank very much Gilles for being with us and for providing to all the programs this clarification related to ISO2. A big round of applause, of course, goes to all our participants. Thank you very much for attending our event. I would also like to thank the colleagues from DG Home who made possible the video that we published on the complementarities and the synergies. And of course, our two colleagues from IPA, Italy, Albania, Montenegro, and Romania, Serbia program for their experience and sharing with you their experience and reflections. I would very much like to thank you, the colleagues from DG Regio, in particular Gilles, and colleagues from TESIM for promoting our event with E&I programs. Very much once again. Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, Ivana, for your support, and see you in other events.
Thank you.